It was July 1944, the air still heavy with the smell of damp earth and cordite. In a narrow, sunken lane, half hidden beneath tangled hedgerows, an American M for Sherman sat motionless, its engine ticking softly as it cooled. Inside, the crew waited, 5 men sealed in steel, listening to the countryside breathe. Then the ground began to tremble. It wasn't artillery. It was deeper, heavier, rhythmic tank engines. Several of them, the gunner pressed his eye to the sight. Through the uneven lattice of leaves, he saw movement, a column of German armor sliding out of the morning haze. Not Panzer IVs, not Stooges. These shapes were broader, longer, unmistakable. Panthers, 5 of them. Their 75mm high-velocity cannons pointed forward like spears. Their armor glinted faintly in the pale sun. They were hunting, and the lone Sherman was directly in their path. The gunner steadied his breathing, his hands tightening around the elevation wheels. 5 enemies. 1 chance. The moment that followed would become one of the most improbable encounters of the Normandy campaign. A moment that demands understanding of how both sides arrived here. Asterisk, in the weeks following the D-Day landings. The Allied foothold in Normandy had grown into a vast, grinding front. What had begun on June 6, 1944, as a daring gamble across the Channel, quickly became a suffocating struggle through France's ancient farmland. The bocage, those thick, centuries-old hedgerows that lined every field, was unlike anything American tank crews had trained for. Walls of earth and tangled roots rose higher than a man's head, broken only by narrow lanes where ambushes waited like coiled traps. Asterisk for the U.S. Army. Progress in this maze was brutally slow. The Sherman, fast, reliable, and built in staggering numbers, found itself fighting in terrain where its strengths meant little and its weaknesses were unforgivingly exposed. Small German teams armed with Panzerfausts lurked in every thicket. Anti-tank guns waited behind corners invisible until the moment they fired. And always, somewhere beyond the hedgerows, the deeper rumble of armored engines signaled the presence of a threat that had already earned a fearsome reputation. The Panther, asterisk the Panther tank. Officially, the Panzer Kampfwagen V was introduced after the shock of encountering the Soviet T-34 in 1941. It had been designed to counter Soviet armor, but it arrived in the West as well, just in time for Normandy. On paper, it was one of the most formidable tanks of the war. Thick, sloped frontal armor and a long 75mm KWK-42 gun, capable of piercing a Sherman at well over a kilometer. German crews trusted it. American crews respected it. No one underestimated it. Asterisk, but in the hedgerows. Even a powerful machine could become trapped by the land it fought on. Asterisk. The U.S. armored advance after D-Day relied on momentum, pushing forward, exploiting gaps, overwhelming resistance with numbers and speed. Yet Normandy refused to cooperate. The German commanders recognized the advantages the terrain offered them and used their armor accordingly. Panthers were positioned in hold-down ambushes along hedgerow openings, firing from cover, pulling back, reappearing elsewhere. Even when attacking, they maneuvered with calculation. Aware of how easily a single wrong turn could expose their vulnerable flanks? Asterisk for the Americans. This environment magnified the Sherman's most critical vulnerability, its armor. Against the Panther's frontal plate, the standard 75mm M3 guns struggled, except at dangerously close ranges or against specific weak points. This was well known among crews, so many of whom had already seen friends lost in the burning wrecks of tanks struck by German high-velocity rounds. Yet the Sherman still had its advantages. It traversed quickly, its optics were reliable, and it was mechanically dependable in ways the Panther often was not. Asterisk still. Numbers alone could not guarantee survival. Skill, nerves, and terrain mattered more than ever. Asterisk by July. As the Allies pushed towards Saint-Lay and deeper into the Norman hedgerow belt, German armored units received increasing pressure to counterattack. They were running short on fuel and replacement vehicles, but what they lacked in quantity They attempted to make up in tactical placement and the sheer lethality of their heavy armor. Panthers from various Panzer divisions, including the 2nd and 116th. Panzer divisions were committed to local counter-thrusts designed to delay American breakthroughs. Asterisk. It was in this environment of close-quarters armored chess that small duels often decided the fate of entire companies. A single Panther positioned at the right gap could halt an American battalion for hours. A lone Sherman hidden near a choke point could disrupt an entire German counterattack. Success in these moments depended on who saw whom first, who fired first, and who understood the strengths and weaknesses of their machine most clearly. Asterisk. Sherman crews adapted quickly. They learned to approach bocage corners with caution, to use the terrain for concealment, and to rely on teamwork inside the cramped steel hull. The gunner's world was narrowed to optics, angles, and milliseconds. The driver felt every vibration of the tracks through the pedals. The commander scanned relentlessly through the split hatch, knowing that the difference between seeing and being seen could mean life or death. Asterisk. By mid-July, the front was a patchwork of such encounters. Many went undocumented, except in unit logs and brief reports. But some stood out for their improbability, moments where training, terrain, timing, and raw skill converged in ways that seemed almost impossible. Asterisk. Moments like the one that would occur when a single Sherman crew found itself staring down 5 German Panthers advancing in formation. Asterisk. An encounter shaped not by luck alone, but by everything that had led the war to this exact lane, on this exact morning. Asterisk. And to understand the full weight of that confrontation, the wider battlefield pressures pressing on both armies must be explored even deeper. Asterisk. By the second half of July 1944, the American advance through Normandy had become a series of grueling, close-range fights along roads so narrow that 2 tanks could barely pass. The push toward key towns like Saint-Lay-Perriers and Coutances required breaking through terrain perfectly suited for German defense. Every field was a fortress. Every hedgerow was a wall, and the units fighting through them were often exhausted, short on sleep, and worn thin by days of constant pressure. Asterisk. Among the American forces operating in this region were elements of the 2nd Armored Division, the 3rd Armored Division, and components of the 4th, 29th, and 30th Infantry Divisions, all advancing along different sectors but facing similar resistance. Their objectives differed, but the reality facing them was shared. The Germans were determined to prevent the Americans from reaching the open ground farther south. If the Allies broke out of the bocage, German defensive lines across France would unravel. Asterisk. To prevent that breakout, German commanders committed what armored strength they still had. Panthers from the Panzerlehr Division, though heavily battered by Allied air power, were still fighting. The 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, pulled from the Eastern Front and already infamous for its brutality, deployed Panthers to counter American thrusts. Even scratch units, rebuilt from surviving tanks and new crews, found themselves thrown into the fight to hold the line. Asterisk. Yet, beneath the imposing reputation of German armor, many crews were inexperienced replacements, young men with minimal training placed into machines, far more complex than the older Panzer IVs. The Panther, for all its firepower, required skill to handle effectively, especially in the restricted Norman countryside. Misjudged angles, slow turret traverse, mechanical strain, or something as simple as a soft roadside ditch could cripple its advantages. Asterisk. American crews didn't know each individual crew's level of training, but they understood the reality. Any Panther was a deadly threat the moment it appeared. Its frontal armor was virtually immune to their standard rounds. Its gun could destroy a Sherman before the American crew even spotted the muzzle flash, and its silhouette, tall and angular, was unmistakable even at dawn. Asterisk. Still, not all engagements favored the German tank. Asterisk. Terrain played its own role. Panthers were at their strongest at long range in open fields, across clear lines of sight, or when positioned on high ground. Normandy offered few such opportunities. Instead, hedgerows often forced Panthers into column formations, funneling them through predictable lanes. If a Sherman was watching one of these routes, And if the crew recognized a vulnerable shot, the battlefield could shift in an instant. Asterisk, this was how many American crews began to recalibrate their approach to tank combat. Rather than relying on armor they knew could not protect them, they emphasized concealment, coordination with infantry, and using the bocage as natural fortification. A Sherman hidden behind a hedgerow could deliver the first shot, sometimes the deciding shot, before a Panther even realized it had been spotted. Asterisk. Training manuals had covered ambush tactics, but in Normandy, these doctrines became instinctive. Crews learned to angle their hulls behind the banked earth, to keep the smallest possible portion of the tank visible, and to remain patient. Engagements were no longer sweeping armored thrusts across open terrain, as early war theorists had imagined. They were quiet, tense confrontations where every second of silence mattered. Asterisk German reports from this period reveal growing frustration. Panthers would enter a lane believing it clear, only to be struck from the side by an unseen gunner. Others became trapped when the soft Norman ground gave way beneath heavy tracks. Fuel shortages forced commanders to limit movement, making armor deployment reactive instead of proactive. And the Americans, increasingly familiar with each hedgerow's shape and every sunken lane's turn, exploited these weaknesses whenever possible. It was in one of these narrow corridors of earth and shadow that a Sherman crew found themselves listening to the low rumble of 5 approaching Panthers. The Germans were likely conducting a probing movement, attempting to punch through a weak point in the American advance or repositioning for a local counterattack. Either way, their formation indicated confidence, the kind rooted in the Panthers' fearsome battlefield reputation, but reputation alone could not protect. A tank's vulnerable side armor? It could not shield the turret ring, the gun mantlet's edges, or the few exposed seams where sloped fronts transitioned to flat plates. A skilled American gunner, given the right angle and the right moment, could exploit those weaknesses if he was willing to hold his nerve long enough to take the shot. And on this particular morning, in this particular lane, one gunner would soon find himself staring through his sight at not 1, but 5 Panthers advancing steadily toward his position, 5 machines built for long-range dominance, now forced into a killing ground where a well-placed round could overturn the assailants entirely. The perspectives shaping this confrontation, human, tactical, technological, and moral, reveal why this moment unfolded the way it did. And those perspectives form the angles of the story that now come sharply into focus. Asterisk. The confrontation between 1 Sherman and 5 advancing Panthers can only be understood by looking through several overlapping lenses: the human experience inside the tank, the tactical reality of the terrain, and the technological truth behind the machines involved. Together, these angles show why an engagement that seemed impossible on paper unfolded the way it did. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Inside a Sherman, the world narrowed to metal, vibration, and instinct. The crew lived shoulder to shoulder, each man relying on the others with a trust deeper than most friendships ever reached. They were not faceless soldiers. They were mechanics, farmers, clerks, and students who had been transformed into an armored team. Their survival depended on rhythm, each crewman performing his role without hesitation. Asterisk, the gunner, seated slightly hunched behind the sight, often carried the heaviest psychological burden. He had no grand view of the battlefield, no wide horizon to scan. His world was reduced to a thin, circular field of magnified light, where death appeared in the shape of silhouettes and angular shadows. He pulled the trigger, knowing that a fraction of a second determined whether his tank delivered the lethal blow or absorbed it. Asterisk commanders, perched halfway out of the cupola when safe, saw more, but they carried the weight of decision. Ordering the gunner to fire meant exposing their own lives and those of the 4 men who trusted them. Hesitate, and the tank could be destroyed. Act too soon, and a poor shot might reveal their position. Asterisk drivers navigated blind corners and tight lanes with little more than instincts and the muffled voice of a commander guiding them. The assistant driver managed the bow gun, watched the front arc, and helped spot threats in the chaos. The loader kept ammunition flowing, sweating in the cramped turret. hands covered in dust and metallic residue as he rammed shells into the breach one after another. Asterisk. Fear was a constant companion. Crews joked about the Sherman's tendency to burn when hit, referring to it grimly as a Ronson. But those jokes masked the truth. Every engagement carried a real chance of being trapped inside a burning hole. Yet they fought on, not because they felt invincible, but because quitting meant abandoning the man beside them. Asterisk on the morning of the encounter. The Sherman crew's emotional landscape would have been a quiet mix of dread and determination. They knew the sound of German engines. They knew the weight of what was coming. But they also knew that if they remained unseen for just a little longer, they could flip the balance of the fight. Asterisk in moments like these. Battles weren't won by statistics or armor thickness. They were won by nerves that held steady under the worst pressure imaginable. Asterisk. A battlefield of traps. Asterisk. Normandy's boucage turned tank warfare into a series of tight, claustrophobic corridors. Instead of maneuvering across open fields, armored units were forced into narrow routes bordered by high walls of earth and vegetation. The Germans used these choke points to devastating effect, placing Panthers where they could fire from near-invulnerable frontal arcs. Asterisk. But the same terrain offered Americans opportunities. If they understood how to use it, Sherman, hidden behind a hedgerow, could become nearly invisible until the moment it fired. The tank's smaller profile made it easier to tuck into shaded cover, and the M4's relatively quick turret traverse, faster than the Panthers, became a vital advantage in sudden engagements. Asterisk for a gunner lying in wait. The key was letting the enemy come close enough to expose their flanks. This demanded discipline. Firing too early wasted the one chance to strike before the Panthers recognized the threat. Firing too late risked giving the enemy an easy target if the Sherman's position was spotted. Asterisk. The Germans often moved in columns because the terrain forced them to. Panthers advancing nose first through a sunken lane had almost no ability to swing their turrets effectively, and their hull-mounted machine guns were useless for spotting threats concealed in the hedgerow. Shadows. Asterisk. A Panther was terrifying at 800 meters. At 80 meters, it could become a target if a gunner understood angles. Asterisk. The Sherman crew in this encounter had the tactical high ground, not in elevation, but in information. Hidden and stationary, they controlled the moment of engagement. The Panthers, moving forward without knowledge of what lurked ahead, were vulnerable in the one place where their frontal armor no longer mattered: the sides, the turret ring, and the thinner plates around the gun mantlet. Asterisk. Every meter the Panthers advanced narrowed their options. Every heartbeat brought them deeper into a natural funnel, where a well-placed round could shatter their advantage. Asterisk. Asterisk. Popular wartime. Myths often painted the Sherman as hopelessly outclassed by the Panther. The truth was more complex. Asterisk. The Panther's frontal hull, 80 millimeters thick and sloped, could easily deflect the Sherman's 75 millimeters rounds, but its side armor was only 40 to 50 millimeters and mostly vertical. A Sherman firing an APC-BC round at close range into the flank had more than enough penetrating power to destroy it. Asterisk. The Panther's gun was extraordinary in open terrain, but in close quarters, its long barrel became a liability. The slow traverse speed of its turret, powered hydraulically off the engine, meant that if the hull wasn't aligned, the gunner struggled to bring the weapon onto a target quickly. In contrast, the Sherman's turret could swing faster, giving its gunner the best chance in a sudden duel. Asterisk. The Panther also suffered from mechanical fragility. Its final drives were notoriously weak, and rough maneuvering in the tight Norman lanes often pushed the machine close to its limits. While powerful, the Panther was never as rugged or forgiving as the Sherman. Asterisk. Technically speaking, the Sherman crew had what they needed: a hidden position, a reliable gun, a quicker turret, and vulnerable targets moving unknowingly into their line of fire. Asterisk. The encounter about to unfold was not a miracle. It was the result of an understanding of these machines' strengths and weaknesses. At the most intimate level, asterisk, what remained were the enemy's intentions, the leadership shaping their movements, and the moral weight resting on each man inside both sets of tanks. The human. Tactical and technological factors framed the confrontation. The remaining angles reveal the deeper forces moving beneath the surface, the mindset of the German crews, the leadership decisions guiding both sides, and the moral weight borne by men whose lives hinged on seconds. To understand why 5 Panthers advanced down that narrow Norman lane, one must step briefly into the perspective of the German crews. By July 1944. The Wehrmacht understood that the Allies possessed overwhelming numbers, but German armored doctrine still emphasized decisive, concentrated force. When armor moved, it moved with purpose, and Panthers were often the spearhead. German tank officers believed in aggressive action, rapid counterattacks, and using the Panthers' superior frontal armor to punch through American lines. But confidence did not mean calm. Inside their turrets, Panther crews shared the same claustrophobia, sweat, and fear as their American counterparts. Their engines ran hot in the restricted Norman terrain. Visibility was poor. Radio communication was often patchy, and they were painfully aware that fuel shortages reduced their ability to maneuver freely. Many German crews in Normandy were also new. Veterans from the Eastern Front had been depleted heavily during previous campaigns. Replacement crews, trained quickly and thrust directly into one of the most challenging environments of the war, often learned their craft under fire. They respected their Panthers, lacked the deep familiarity needed to exploit every advantage. When a group of 5 Panthers advanced together, they carried a sense of strength. They believed that whatever waited ahead would struggle to stop them, especially a lone Sherman. The battlefield reports from American units frequently recorded German tanks pushing aggressively through lanes and hedgerows, assuming that their armor would absorb whatever the Allies could fire, yet this confidence created blind spots.